As you're getting settled, I have everybody muted. We also recommend that you watch in speaker view so you can see the slides. Because you're muted, we're going to ask that you just submit your questions via the chat. Jennifer and Joshua are going to move pretty quickly. They've got a lot of species to cover. So we'll take questions at the end, and we can go as long as there are questions left to be asked. So we'll just wait another minute or two and then get started.
Javier is here. Oh, wow. My undergrad advisor is here. Oh, I'm getting a little.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And Dr. Hadlock is here. I see.
Hopefully they send you a clap in the in the chat later. All right.
See you all. The Bruckner family. All right, I'm laughing at that, Josh.
Yep, they're here.
All right, everyone, we're gonna get started shortly. Again, you're all muted, so please submit questions in the chat, and Jennifer and Joshua will be answering them at the end of the presentation. Just a few quick upcoming events. We've got our winter animal scavenger hunt, which goes live on Saturday. So if you want to enjoy the fresh snow and get out on some trails, you can find information on our website. We also have coming up next week a fireside chat with Barbara Peskin. She'll be sharing photos of spring birds and some of her favorite photos from birds that she's seen in Lincoln. And then next Saturday, the 27th, the Rural Land Foundation will be hosting an ice sculpture demonstration at the green at the mall at Lincoln Station. And we encourage you all to drop by and check it out, socially distanced. Twisted Tree will have some hot chocolate they're selling, and it should be a nice way to celebrate Lincoln's Winter Carnival. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and invite Jennifer to start the program.
Okay, can you confirm that you can see my title slide?
Yes, looks great.
All right, great. Let's get started. Thank you for inviting us to speak to everybody today. I'm going to jump right in with the first part of the talk, which is going to be about invasive plants, and then Josh is going to finish up with a talk about invasive insects. So just first of all, when I talk to you about invasive plants, what I mean is non-native plant species that spread into native or minimally managed areas in Massachusetts, plants that cause economic or environmental harm by developing self-sustaining populations and becoming dominant or disruptive to those natural systems. And if you want to think about it in a particular way, think about it like this is separating something like kudzu from something like a dandelion in your lawn. So when I was asked to speak to you guys, I decided to try to look into more about what is the most common invasive plant in Lincoln. And I was able to come up with a list, and I was going to talk to you about them. And then I thought, actually, I'm going to have you guys try to guess. And after the talks are over, we can go back to review your guesses and see how well you did. So what I'm asking you to do is just take a brief moment, if you can. If you can't, that's fine. Go to this website, menti.com, menti.com, enter the code 8498426. I know that's long, but Bryn agreed that she would put the information in the chat so that if I go to the next slide quickly, you can still get the number. And you should put in what you think the most common invasive plant found in Lincoln is, and we'll see how good you are at guessing, okay? So let's talk about what it means to be an invasive plant in Massachusetts. If you're a really bad invasive plant, you make my agency's prohibited plant list. It's a list of about 140 species that were determined by the state's invasive plant advisory group to be invasive or to have invasion potential. If you'd like to look at that list, because it's a long list, you can go to mass.gov and just search in that big search window on that front page for prohibited plant list, and it will come up. You can download it if you want in either by scientific name or common name. So let's talk about a few invasive thugs, things that you're probably already likely familiar with. For example, Japanese knotweed or Falloponia japonica, pictured here on the left and the right. Like its common name suggests, it's native to Asia. It was actually introduced to the US a long time ago in the late 1700s as an ornamental species, but also for forage for grazing animals, and it was recommended for erosion control. It has hollow noded stems like bamboo. It actually takes up a lot of water as it grows, but it is not related to bamboo. It's not a grass. It's a perennial non-woody plant. It reproduces by underground stems or rhizomes, but it can also reproduce by seed or by just merely having a chunk of stem with a leaf node scattered about or mowed into the landscape. It grows along roadsides, which is where a lot of you probably see it. It likes wet areas, it likes riparian ecosystems, and it can grow in full sun, but also pretty much any type of light. And here's Japanese knotweed doing what it does best, which is ruining man-made landscapes, in this case, breaking through some asphalt in a place where people probably wish it wasn't growing. But this is just a way of showing you the incredible strength and pressure that the new fresh stems exert as they're emerging from that underground stem base. If you're looking for Japanese knotweed right now, you're likely going to see something like the picture either on the left or the right. So it dies back to the ground once it gets really cold, once a hard frost hits. But you'll see the stems persisting. They tend to be sort of like a rusty orange color. And you will see seeds persisting or fruits persisting on the plants well into the winter. By the time the whole winter is over, most of these stems will collapse, but you can use them as an indicator for where fresh growth is going to come up each spring. Let's say you're trying to get rid of Japanese knotweed. If you've got a really small patch of it, you might just be able to have success by manually pulling or digging it out. You just need to be sure to dig deep enough down that you get any of the underground stem base out with it. The other thing, and this is true for pretty much any invasive species, it is never a one-year project. You always have to go back to the site and check in upcoming years to make sure that you didn't miss something. Some folks have had luck covering Japanese knotweed infestations with tarps. So you cut it as close to the ground as you can, you cover it with a tarp, you weigh the tarp down with something very heavy, make sure it's an opaque tarp, use a thick layer of crushed stone or something like that, basically smother it to death. And then you might be able to check it the next season and maybe dig out anything that remains, but it's still going to take you several years to get through it. Mowing can be used as a control option, but not as an eradication option, really. You'd have to be mowing it once a week the entire growing season for years before you could even just say that you reduced the amount of biomass that was there. You're not going to be able to eradicate it that way. And honestly, I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but the fastest way of getting rid of Japanese knotweed is through herbicide use. In fact, in the UK, where it is illegal to have Japanese knotweed on your property, and if you're trying to sell your property, you have to remove all of the Japanese knotweed from it before you can actually complete the sale. What they do there is that they use typically a product with glyphosate or sometimes with triclopyr. So that's things like Roundup or Brush Be Gone. They cut the plants down to the ground in the spring or early summer, and they squirt or paint the stems or squirt into the stems glyphosate. And then any growth that comes back, they hit again with a foliar spray in the fall so that the chemical is taken down into the rhizome base for an extra blast of death that will basically eradicate the knotweed in 2 seasons. So one fun fact about Japanese knotweed is that it can hybridize with a relative known as giant knotweed that there are probably not many people have heard of. I think the closest to the Lincoln area that you could find it would be in Weston on School Street, where it has mixed in really well with some regular Japanese knotweed. Unfortunately, the two plants hybridize. The hybrid has what's known as hybrid vigor, so it grows much bigger and taller than either parent plant. So you get these 14 feet high plants with medium-sized leaves. And unfortunately, they respond differently to herbicide and control, so that it can be very pervasive when you get all three of these species mixed in to a single area. The next species I want to talk to you about is Asiatic Bittersweet, another plant that you've probably heard of. Is it the top plant in Lincoln? I don't know. You guys tell me. Don't forget to vote. One of the things about Asiatic Bittersweet that makes it such a successful invader is that it is a woody perennial vine. So every year it's going to be putting out new growth, but the existing branches are going to remain, the existing vines. So if you look at the picture on the left here, you can see it doing really well in a stand of pine. I think this is in Needham, in the town of Needham, Mass, growing up and up and up until it's basically scaling the pine and hanging over. And then on the right, you have what happens to trees if you let Asiatic Bittersweet go. So this is from Ashland State Park. There's a tree under there somewhere. It's probably dead, or it's going to be dead soon, because the Asiatic Bittersweet is girdling the tree by running its stem along the trunk and then slowly squeezing it tighter and tighter, cutting off the circulatory system of the tree. And also the tree can't photosynthesize because there's no sunlight getting to its leaves. So eventually it's just going to take that tree down physically. Like its common name suggests, this is another species native to Asia. It was introduced, there is somebody drawing on the screen or something? That is really weird. Is that me? Hopefully no one can see that weird red line. Speak up, Bryn, if you can.
I can. I don't know how to get rid of it, but
Dan Lynch is drawing on the screen. I'd like him to stop, but I'm going to keep talking in the interest of time, and maybe somebody can get rid of that weirdness. Anyway, Asiatic Bittersweet was introduced to the US in the mid-1800s for ornamental purposes. And it can be found in virtually any disturbed habitat these days. The seeds are spread by birds, but the roots can also sucker. Most people recognize Asiatic Bittersweet by the fruits. So here's a picture, a close-up of the fruits, and here's a very heavily fruit-laden female plant there. Birds are very attracted to the bright red fruits with the contrasting bracts of a sort of a salmon color behind it. Unfortunately, Asiatic Bittersweet is like bird junk food. It's full of sugar and not the fats and lipids that they should be chowing down on when it's time to migrate. So another reason we don't want to encourage the spread of this species. Okay, so what do you want to do if you're trying to get rid of Asiatic Bittersweet? Again, small patches, manual or mechanical removal works pretty well. If it's a really thin vine, you can just pull it out. They have really bright orange roots. It's a good ID character. If you're pulling them out, it's easy to kind of track as you're pulling the entire thing out. If once the vines get really thick and woody, like tree trunk diameter, then you're going to want to cut them and then apply some kind of an herbicide just to the stem so that you're avoiding any non-target exposure to other plants, so that you're killing anything below ground so that it doesn't sucker up again. You know,
Jennifer, sorry to interrupt. I think if you stop your screen share and restart it, it should clear the red lines. And I removed that person from the meeting. I think it was probably an accident, but just in case.
I'm glad.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. I'm glad that that's all that was drawn was lines. So, all right. How does that look? Better?
Yep, all better.
Okay, good. Okay. So all I was going to just add on to this section here is that, you know, if you're not able to apply herbicide and all you're able to do is cut it back, then at least give yourself the satisfaction of cutting the stems as far down to the ground as you can, and then watching all the above ground growth wither and die. It's not going to eradicate the bittersweet, but it'll knock it back a little. And like I said, it's sort of personally satisfying to kind of watch it die as it is growing all the way up into the tree. Something important for you to do if you're concerned about Asiatic bittersweet is get to know the way the leaves look, the leaf orientation and shape. They're oppositely paired leaves. They are oval shaped and they have wavy teeth around the margins. The reason why this is important is that this is a dioecious species. It has separate male and female plants. So if all you're doing is learning the way Asiatic bittersweet looks by the way the berries look, you're missing all the male plants because they don't put out fruit. Fun facts about Asiatic bittersweet: it is illegal for people to make and sell decorations made from bittersweet wreaths, from bittersweet vines that include the fruit, because that's a violation of our prohibited plant list rules. And that picture on the left of a bittersweet wreath was actually something that was hanging on the door of a church where I was invited to give a presentation about invasive plants once, which is like the definition of ironic. The other thing though is that once the vines get thick enough, you can make some really crazy cool looking furniture with it. All right, the last common invader I want to talk about is tree of heaven. Not because it's necessarily that common in Lincoln, but because it's sort of integral to what Josh is going to be talking about in a little while for the second half of the presentation. This is another Asian species that was introduced in the late 1700s to America as an ornamental tree, where it was prized for its tropical, fancy-looking foliage in very wealthy people's estate gardens. Unfortunately, it is a very aggressively growing species, and the seeds can sprout pretty much anywhere. So if the seed blows into the crack in the pavement or the crack between a building and pavement, then a new plant can sprout up. If you've read the book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, this is the tree they're talking about. Another problem is that once the plants start to grow, and they grow really fast, the root system grows fast, they can actually crack underground pipes with the force of their growth. In terms of identifying tree of heaven, to me, it's easiest to do when the plant, during the growing season, when there's leaves on the plant. What you're looking at here is one entire leaf with several smaller leaflets. And if you look at each leaflet and look at where the red arrow is pointing, you'll see that each leaflet has this asymmetrical little lobe here, here, here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but anyway, just look where the red arrow is pointing. So you can distinguish it from other plants that have these feather-shaped, or what they call pinnately compound leaves, such as staghorn and smooth sumac, which are native species that tend to occupy the same kind of disturbed habitat as tree of heaven. But you'll notice on both of those species, they have obviously toothed leaflet margins. And of course, staghorn sumac is very hairy or fuzzy. Also, once tree of heaven starts to flower and fruit, the fruits are very, very obvious against the leaves. They have this sort of like sunset, golden, reddish, orange color to them. But this is another dioecious species, so only the females are going to have this, not the males. Once the fruits begin to dry out, they become these very papery, like beige-ish achenes that they're wind dispersed, and they will kind of tend to hang on to the plants throughout the winter in some cases. So you can use that as an ID character if you're, say, spotting tree of heaven along the Mass Pike, like some of us do as a hobby. Also, if you're getting up close to tree of heaven, you can look for the bud scars. To me, this looks like a scary clown face. Maybe I just have a problem with clowns. I don't know, but you can definitely see the kind of pareidolia here. It looks like a weird smiley face. The bark of the tree is smooth and kind of greenish on really young trees. And then as the trees mature, the bark kind of looks like the skin of a cantaloupe. And I remember I didn't put any fun facts in about tree of heaven because that's going to be Josh's job to talk about. So then let's check my watch, 7:20, we're sort of doing okay. 3 invasive plant species you need to know now. So these are things I hope you haven't seen, but unfortunately we have them in certain areas of Massachusetts. If you do see them, I want you to report them. The first is giant hogweed. And this is my coworker, Trevor, who is one of the tallest people that I work with. And I tell you this so you can just get a sense of how freaking big those inflorescences are in the background, they top out at, 10 to 12 feet or more. This is a really big plant. Everything about this plant is like extra large. This is a Eurasian native, so it's native to like Russia and Europe. It was introduced, of course, for its ornamental value back in the 1800s. First was found in Massachusetts back in 2002. This is an herbaceous biennial or short-lived perennial. Basically, once it bolts or puts out that giant inflorescence, that sends signals to the plant that it's time to die. That typically happens after its second year of life, but if for some reason it doesn't, it might persist for another few years. So this is a problem because this plant is known to invade natural areas, and it promotes soil erosion because those inflorescences are so big and top heavy. If they're growing in, say, a riparian ecosystem along a river, when they grow and it's, the inflorescences die back in the fall and winter, and then they tip over and they take all the soil with them along with their root mass. And this is the one plant I'm going to talk about tonight that's actually a federally listed noxious weed. That's because it has what they call phototoxic sap. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what phototoxic sap is. So if you don't want to see something gross, then you should look the other way until I say it's okay, because this is definitely a gross picture. So phototoxic sap is sap from the plant that causes a bad chemical reaction on your skin when it's exposed to sunlight. It causes these really nasty fluid-filled blisters to form on the skin, and then that same skin is going to have photosensitivity for years afterwards. And I'm now clicking off of the gross photo if you were looking the other way. So the problem with giant hogweed is, now that it's already been brought to the US and it's been here a while, it's spreading through soil transport. The seeds have an incredibly long-lived seed bank, 6 years. If people have hogweed in their yards and it could end up in their yard waste, it should never be put in compost. No invasive species should be put in composting unless you're 100% sure that there's no reproductive parts in there. And of course, if it's growing along, in a wetland or in a wet area, then flooding and soil erosion is going to be spreading the plants as well. So here's a map showing you every place we know of where there's giant hogweed. The red circles with the white diamonds in the middle are active infestations. The green diamonds are places where we've eradicated it. And eradicated means that we have gone back to that site for 6 years or more and not found any hogweed. So if we miss a plant and those seeds mature and hit the ground, sets the clock back another 6 years, which is really frustrating. It makes eradication really difficult. If you're trying to identify giant hogweed, the first thing to think about is, again, everything about this plant is really, really big. The leaves grow in a rosette, a basal rosette around the bottom of the stem, and they can grow up to 5 feet wide. They're very deeply lobed, and each lobe is deeply cut again into very pointed teeth. If you can get close enough to look at the stem is covered with these like short stubbly hairs and purple speckles. And then there are these this like corona of hairs around the leaf axil. So that red arrow is showing where the leaf is wrapped around the stem, and then you have that little collar there. Compare that to a native relative of giant hogweed known as cow parsnip, which is not quite as big, but looks very similar in terms of its leaf shape and everything. But the stems are typically solid green, no speckles, and they have much more dense covering of hairs. In terms of the way that the flowers look, think Queen Anne's lace on steroids, right? So that pen is for scale in picture 3, and that inflorescence is, they could be up to 2 feet across, but it's certainly much bigger than a pen. And sometimes we get people that report Queen Anne's lace to us and they think it's like a baby version of hogweed, but plants don't work that way. So you'll know when you say hogweed. We actually have a fact sheet up on our website that I'll put I'll put a link in the chat to these so that you can get them, because we do get lookalikes. People report cow parsnip and sometimes angelica and other plants that are in the carrot family that kind of look similar. We are actively managing all the hogweed sites we know about with the goal of eradication. We actually have a grant right now. We're working with contractors to treat some of the really large, like acre plus sites that we have out in Western Mass to try to knock those back. Some of our smaller sites, we still do hand pulling. You can also cut the taproot because it's a biennial. If you can slam that taproot with a shovel, it'll kill the plant off. If we miss plants, we sometimes go back and lop the flower heads off and then stick them in plastic bags and bake them in the sun. But again, our big sites are getting treated right now with glyphosate because they're just so large. No one should do any of these types of management on giant hogweed without wearing proper protective equipment so that you have no chance that you're getting the sap anywhere near your skin. So our folks wear Tyvek suits and goggles and gloves so that there's just no risk that they could get hurt. All right, second plant, Myelominute vine, Polygonum portfoliatum. This is an interesting plant because it's a vine and it's super fast growing and aggressive and a great invasive, but it's annual, which means that when the growing season ends, it dies. It makes control a little bit easier than with something like Asiatic Bittersweet if you get the timing right. Unfortunately, the seeds, again, like hogweed, live a really long time in the soil. So if you miss some plants and they set fruit, then again, the clock gets reset. Myelominute vine loves edge habitats, so along forests, rivers, and roads, and it wants strong light, but it can kind of be a sleeper species growing in the shade and not being that invasive. It's native to Eastern Asia and first showed up in the US back in Oregon in 1890. The first known successful population was in Pennsylvania, and it's now found pretty much throughout the Northeast except for upper New England. It's being transported around from infested sites, at least in Massachusetts, in contaminated soil and vehicles that have the fruit stuck in the tires and other equipment. Wild animals also eat the fruit and spread it around that way. Here's a map showing you every place we have that we know about Myelominute in, excuse me, I just need some water. So, in Massachusetts. I always think the most interesting thing is looking, and Bryn, can you just tell me, can you see my mouse pointer?
Yes.
Okay, I would hate to keep using it and find out that people didn't see it. Okay, so to me, this line is really key here. This is basically this is following the Neponset River down into the southeastern part of the state, which is what this plant did from the main infestation that we have in Foul Meadow, which is in the Blue Hills Reservation. But we definitely have it in other counties. We're not exactly sure how it's getting transported around, but we have a feeling it's through soil movement and from sharing of contaminated equipment. This is a shot of it growing in Foul Meadow in the Blue Hills Reservation. I just want to show you, like, again, even though this plant is dying at the end of every growing season, it's still putting out so much biomass that it's creating a virtual carpet here where most of the herbivorous understory is just being smothered out. But it's never going to do what bittersweet does, where it completely kills a tree. It can only kill shorter things, I guess. The best way to ID Myelominute vine is to look at the leaves. They're almost perfectly triangular. There are a lot of other similar species that sort of look this way, but really aren't. I'll show you a picture in a second. The second thing you can do is look at the stem. There are these small curved barbs along the stem. If you can comfortably grab the stem of the vine, it is likely not Myelominute vine because those prickles really do hurt. We use gloves when we pull them. The third thing you can look for is the saucer-shaped leaves or ochrea that are at the stem nodes of the plant. They sort of look like a collar around the stem. They're very, very showy. Also, if the plant is in fruit, the fruits are this amazing sort of fake metallic blue looking color, which is very, very recognizable. I don't know any other plant other than porcelain berry, which is a woody vine that looks completely different that has that blue color. There are, like I said, there are a lot of similar species. I'll put a link in the chat to our fact sheet in case you want to download something like that to have. So I don't think we're going to eradicate Myelominute vine, but we're actively managing several sites of it in Massachusetts. And I know the Department of Conservation and Recreation is working on a few sites as well. We do have that big site in Foul Meadow. There's also Francis Crane Wildlife Management Refuge in Falmouth that has a lot of it, plus the ones you saw on the map out in Western Mass. Checking the time, almost done. All right, what are we doing in terms of mile-a-minute management? Well, again, it's an annual. So if you can catch it before it fruits, then you can just pull it out, and maybe you can even leave it just on the ground and not have to worry about it rerooting or anything like that. The problem is that there's so much of it that it's hard to catch it at the right time that you can do that. Once it's starting to fruit, you have to be a lot more careful about what you're doing and deal with like disposal of all that biomass. There are herbicides available, but we typically don't use them in our own work because mile-a-minute vine tends to just show up in wetland areas a lot, which means that's just not a good option. But the one thing that we do have that, well, the program just ended, but for several years, we were able to release a biocontrol insect, a very, very tiny weevil that only eats mile-a-minute vine at the sites listed here. And then we've subsequently found it nearby in Dedham and in several other towns that have mile-a-minute vine, but we never released the weevils. It's possible that they got carried along when the mile-a-minute vine got accidentally introduced, but at least the weevils are there. They're not really knocking back populations in the very heavily infested areas, but we're hoping that their populations will continue to build over time. All right, last one is kudzu. All right, that picture was from a site in Needham, Mass. A lot of people don't realize we have kudzu here. We actually sometimes describe invasive plants in New England as the kudzu of the north if they're really bad, but we actually have kudzu. So unfortunately we do. This is a semi-woody, rapidly growing perennial vine that reproduces mostly by runners, which are stems that run just at the level of the soil. And this is another plant like bittersweet that's going to cover large areas of land and smother any plant that it grows over. It was introduced to the US in the late 1800s as a ground cover to combat soil erosion. But that's not why we're seeing it in Massachusetts. I think people were just planting it for its ornamental value, I guess. We first found it here in the 1980s. Here's a map of our known populations of kudzu in Massachusetts. I don't need to include the whole state because we don't know of anything west of Needham and Dedham, and I hope it stays that way. In terms of identifying kudzu, this is a legume. It's in the same family as beans and peas. So it has those similar trifoliate leaves. So each leaf has 3 leaflets, and each one of those leaflets is typically lobed. So it kind of either looks like a mitten or like a person, going like that. And if you look here, this is diagnostic. The stem of the main leading leaflet tends to be really long compared to the really short stems on the side leaflets. You can also look up close for these tiny orangey brown hairs that run along the stem of the plant, and also these little stipules that can be found at the base of each leaf stem or petiole. So one pair here, one pair here, one pair there. If you catch it in flower, you're probably going to smell it. It actually kind of smells like grape soda when they're in flower. They flower very late, around October or so, in Massachusetts. And then once the plants go to fruit, you get these really thin, hairy brown pods. There are a lot of similar species. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and just kind of talk about what we've been doing in terms of trying to eradicate it. So either the state or town involved, or in some cases the National Park Service, is managing stands of kudzu across the state because we feel like we can get rid of it before it starts to really spread. This is a species I'm concerned is kind of one of those sleeper species they talk about, where the more climate change impacts Massachusetts, the more hospitable of an environment Massachusetts is going to be for kudzu. This is an example of one of the sites we're managing in Needham, Massachusetts. I wouldn't even say we are managing it because we're done managing it. This is from, I cannot see the date because of all the menus up here, but I think it says 2011. Hopefully people can see the year. Bryn, can you see that? Maybe you can't either because you're an
Yes,
admin.
we can see it.
All right, good. This is what the site looked like when we first got permission to eradicate it. It was, the kudzu had been planted by the original owner of the house who had gotten old and unfortunately passed away, and things just really got out of control in the garden. It was taking over the backyard of this property plus the adjoining land, which leads to Hemlock Gorge, which is a DCR property. This is what it looked like after the first year of us managing it. And basically a team of us went in and treated it with glyphosate and also severed any of the vines that were clambering up into the trees and painted the bases with herbicide. We knocked it back really well after this first year, although you can still see this patch here. So we went back and did a second, much smaller treatment. And also we had to reseed this hill with a grass seed because we were concerned about soil erosion. After a couple more years, the site was looking pretty good. I think the year we went back for this, we found 2 very tiny stems of kudzu that were hidden among the weeds down at the base here. And we just treated, did we treat them or did we pull them? I think we treated them, but it was just a very tiny amount. And then this is from just a few months ago. I guess it wasn't a few months ago. Time passes weirdly now, but this is from the end of last year. There's a new owner here. I wouldn't say this is the most pristine site because there's a lot of other invasives that have kind of come in here, but there is absolutely no sign of kudzu. So I'm calling this one a win. In the meantime, we found someone else that was growing it in Needham, and we're working to eradicate that. I think it's going to be gone after next season. Okay, so lessons learned, other than that I can't give this talk fast no matter how hard I try. It is way cheaper and easier to deal with a plant that is invasive if you can find it before it gets really well established. So the kudzus versus the Japanese knotweeds. And that means that everybody needs to keep informed about really high priority plant invaders in order to detect them early. And so I am going to point you to the website here, massnrc.org/pests. We not only have fact sheets for all of this, the really high priority species like Myeloma, vine, and hogweed, but we have a reporting system that you can use for both plants and insects. And Josh will mention it again at the end of his talk. If you ever see anything that you think is weird that you need to get identified, we're there for you. If you just send us a photo, we can figure out what it is. And that's it for now. I think we'll revisit the survey after Josh's talk, if that's okay. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass the baton to Bryn or to Josh, whatever you prefer.
Josh, you can go ahead and start sharing. I think we'll take all questions at the end.
Okay, 1 second. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Josh. I'm the Forest Pest Outreach Coordinator for Massachusetts, and like Jen, I'm going to be talking about a lot of different invasive insects here, and I'm going to try and get in under the time limit. And if you have any questions about any of the things I'm talking about, just you can type your question into the chat, and Jen and I will get to all of your questions at the end of this. So I'm just going to dive right in with our first insect, spotted lanternfly. I'm not going to go over the definition of like an invasive insect. It's pretty similar to the definition that Jen talked about with invasive plants. It's a non-native insect that's been introduced, usually through human intervention, accidental or perhaps on purpose, that's causing some sort of economic or environmental harm. So in the case of the spotted lanternfly, this little guy right here, Latin name Lycorma delicatula, it is in the order Hemiptera, and which means it's a true bug. So even though it kind of looks like a butterfly or a moth here with those nice spread wings, it's actually more closely related to things like aphids and stink bugs and assassin bugs. This means it has a sucking, piercing proboscis or mouth part that it uses to suck the sap out of plants. It has a whole lot of different host species, including things like tree of heaven, which was talked about earlier, black walnut, maple, grapes, apples, and hops. It has a very, very extensive host list, which is why it's such a species of concern. So you'll see what that list looks like later. Like with pretty much all the invasive insects we're talking about here, and a lot of the ones that were in Jen's talk, it is from Asia. One of the risks of our interconnected global economy is it's very easy for things like insects and plants to kind of get moved around accidentally. So this is more pictures of the spotted lanternfly. It's a good sized insect, about half to maybe a little more than an inch long. And you can see in these photos here, it doesn't always have that bright red hind wing on display, which makes it seem very obvious, easy to identify. A lot of the pictures you'll see of the insect, it has those bright red wings spread. But usually when it's at rest in the wild, it has these gray mottled forewings over the top, so you can't really see that red wing underneath. When the females are gravid, they get these like striped yellow and black abdomens, but normally it's just like a black abdomen. And you'll notice, this is one thing that distinguishes it from a butterfly or moth. It doesn't have long, prominent antennae. You'll see the tiny little orange dot right underneath the. That is the antenna. They have very, very short, stubby ones. But generally speaking, again, if you're looking for this insect in the wild, the adult insect anyway, this is what you want to look for. It's got these long, spindly legs, the tiny little orange antenna, and the gray mottled forewings that make it pretty good for camouflage. You can see it's kind of blends into the bark of this tree. You can kind of see the red coloration peeking through, but again, unless it's jumping or flying or it's displayed when it's dead, you're not really going to see the red wings like that. So this insect was first found in Pennsylvania in 2014. That's the first time it was identified in the United States. Again, its native range is East Asia, places like China and Vietnam. It was introduced to a lot of other East Asian countries like Korea and Japan. It had probably been here in the United States since as early as 2012, just given the size it was found in 2014. And it most likely arrived via a shipment of crushed stone that got sent from somewhere in East Asia to a garden center in Pennsylvania. The eggs hatched and the nymphs and were able to spread and kind of become established that way. It is currently found in 26 different Pennsylvania counties, where it has pretty severe economic and social impact on Pennsylvania and other nearby states. In Massachusetts, and you'll see a map momentarily of where else it's been found, but it's been found in a couple of different places in Massachusetts, including Billerica, Boston, Concord, Milford, Norwood, and Sharon. So even though it is not established in Massachusetts, it can get up this far north. So these are the places in Pennsylvania where it has been identified. The orange counties, again, it was first found in Berks County, right here, so kind of near Pennsylvania or near Philadelphia. The orange counties are kind of the original quarantines, and the blue ones were added in 2020. And this map shows all the places in the US where it has been identified. The purple dots on the screen are places where the insect has been found, but there's no established population. The blue are where there are established infestations. You can see the nearest one is in the southwest corner of Connecticut. And the red lines are established state quarantines. You can see the counties from the previous map in Pennsylvania are highlighted, as well as nearby counties in New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. And infestations have been spread also to Ohio, New York, Connecticut. Not all the places in Massachusetts are highlighted, but again, the first one in Massachusetts was found in Boston in 2018, and then a couple more were found in 2020. So again, there's no established population in Massachusetts, but the fact that it was found means this insect can easily hitchhike from other states and be moved across the state lines, which is we'll talk about later, but it is one of the main risks of this insect. It's highly mobile and very easy for it to be spread through human activity. So as I mentioned at the top, this being a true bug, it is a sap sucker. So it goes after the sap of plants. You can see here this tree that you can see all the sap running down the side of the tree. And this has a couple of different negative effects on tree health. The insect is not going to digest all of the sap that it feeds on, so it excretes a lot of the sap in a very sticky, sweet waste called honeydew, which does a couple of things. So the honeydew, which you can see building up at the bottom of the tree, all that white stuff, that sticky, sweet substance, it promotes the growth of a sooty mold, kind of a black mold that is going to kill whatever plant it grows on. Feeding on the tree repeatedly or the plant is going to lead to branch dieback. It's going to reduce the tree's ability to photosynthesize, so it can't feed itself as well. The fruit, any fruit that the tree puts out is going to produce less sugars, and the tree has less cold tolerance. So it's not going to directly kill the tree, but over repeated feedings and times, you have a much weaker tree that can't produce as much fruit. It can't survive the cold as long. And then it's going to be covered in this honeydew. It's going to be covered in sooty mold. And that honeydew is going to attract nuisance insects like wasps, ants, bees, hornets. So it's really a really unpleasant situation. You can kind of see what that looks like here. You can again see the black sooty mold growing over the rocks and the ground all over the place, and the insects are starting to swarm. And that honeydew is not just going to get on the ground and it's going to harm plants, but it can get on anything that the insects are above. This is someone's back porch covered in honeydew. It can get on, a car that's parked under a tree filled with lanternfly, lawn furniture, street, sidewalk, side of a house, whatever, and that's hard to clean up. So you've got this insect has a lot of really negative impacts on people's lives, including just unpleasantness, aesthetic unpleasantness. This is someone's backyard, and this silver maple is completely covered in spotted lanternfly. Sooty mold is all over the ground. And the problem with this insect, of course, as you're seeing here, is there's not just a couple of them that show up. They swarm in huge numbers and completely cover whatever trees that they're feeding on. To give you a very visceral example of what this looks like, we have a video that comes from Pennsylvania that someone took of a tree that is attracting a lot of spotted lanternfly. So you can see what that looks like. All right, and that's my favorite part of the presentation. Usually, I get to see people's reactions, but I can imagine everyone's pretty grossed out. So as I mentioned at the top, lanternfly has a lot of different host species. The main one is tree of heaven, which Jen talked about in her part of the conversation, which is a non-native plant. But the problem is lanternfly has a lot of other common hosts, including things that are valuable to humans, things like apple trees, stone fruit trees like plums, peaches, cherries, and apricots, grapevines, maple trees. It really prefers things like silver maple and red maple, black walnut, and then a whole host of others, including things like birch trees, hops, beech trees, willows, London plane trees, pears, blueberry bushes. Things like basil and rose are very common indicators or hosts of the nymphs, the early life stages. It's at least 70 different host plants that can be targeted by this insect. And of course, tree of heaven is again, their main host tree. Some more pictures of it in case you kind of wanted more of that. I do say main host in that if there is a tree of heaven in the area, spotted lanternfly will be drawn to that, and so that's a good place to look for tree of heaven to look for signs of lanternfly initially. But that does not mean if there's no tree of heaven in an area, there definitely can't be spotted lanternfly. There have been studies that show that they can complete their life cycle on other trees such as black walnut or cherries. This is just their preferred host plant. So again, good place to look for if you're trying to look for them in the area. You'll notice they don't go after the fruit themselves. You can see them on this apple tree and these grapevines, but they're going after the plant themselves. But those fruit are going to get covered in the honeydew and the sooty mold, which is going to render them unsellable. Again, when the plant is severely damaged by repeated feedings, the fruit produces less sugar, so it's not as tasty. And this is a photo of a vineyard in Pennsylvania where there's really heavy damage. These vineyards have seen up to 70% loss of their plants. So there can be really severe damage with bad infestations. And so you can see what the economic impact of spotted lanternfly is. Vineyards, apple orchards, a lot of different fruit producers. The alcohol industry would certainly be at risk because things like grapes, apples, hops are all used to produce alcoholic beverages. So this insect, if it were established in Massachusetts, would have a huge impact on the economy and the way of life. The life cycle. So this insect goes through what's called incomplete metamorphosis, where it has nymphs rather than a larva and then a pupa, and the nymphs are wingless, and the eggs overwinter. So what happens is once the eggs hatch in late spring, like May or June, The nymphs kind of get larger and larger. They will suck on sap. They'll start by feeding on things like very succulent plants like rose or basil, or on the leaves of trees, and they get larger and larger. The adults emerge in late summer, and this when they get their wings, and then they can feed directly on like the bark or the trunk of a tree before they lay their eggs. The adults will die off with the first hard frost, but the eggs will survive over winter, and that's how the life cycle propagates. So at this time of year in the winter, you'd want to look for the egg masses, which look like this. The eggs themselves are kind of these little dots, or these seeds that are all connected, and the female will usually cover them with this gray putty-like substance to protect them. And you can see how well this camouflages into surfaces like tree bark or a rock. And again, these eggs are highly mobile, or rather the eggs can be laid on basically any flat surface. They're not just on the trunk or the bark of a tree. They can be laid on things as varied as, rocks, sides of potted plants, sides of vehicles, shipping containers, pallets, anything that would get like put on a truck and shipped across state lines, camping equipment, firewood, the underside of a vehicle. They've been found in like light bulbs and on cushions on lawn furniture. So a lot of ways that these eggs can accidentally be moved from one place with a heavy infestation to another. The adults as well can hitchhike, just by hanging out in the vehicle. And there's another photo of the eggs that I've compared on the right to a gypsy moth egg mass, which is probably a pretty common sight, but you'll notice the gypsy moth egg mass is kind of more of a brown color and very, very fuzzy. So it's texturally different as well as in terms of color. So you can again see like the nymphs of the lanternfly swarming over this vehicle. The egg masses can be laid on, side of a picnic table or basically anything else. And these are very easy ways for the insect to move around. So again, even though the insect's not established in Massachusetts, they've shown up here because they've all, the adults kind of hitched a ride on something that was getting imported. So things like railways, highways, shipping routes are great ways for this insect to move around, any sort of transport. So just things to look out for. Got a couple other invasive insects and bugs to cover, so I'm going to kind of move right along to the Asian longhorn beetle, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. Its Latin name is Inoplophora glabripennis, and this insect has been in Massachusetts for quite some time. It's, again, native to East Asia, and this is a wood-boring insect, so it is a pest of hardwood trees. It bores into trees and develops inside them, and ultimately leads to their death. So identification of the insect, you can see what they look like right here, and they're pretty distinct looking. They're pretty large. They're about 3/4 to 1.5 inches long. You'll notice they're kind of got this bluish tinge to their feet and their antenna, which is when they're alive. When they're dead, that bluish tinge kind of fades. Most distinctly, they have a very shiny black body with these kind of white splotches and these very long antenna, which have white bands on them. In the female, the antenna are about as long as the body, and the male, which tends to be a bit smaller in size, has longer antenna than the body. So these are pretty good indicators, although at this point in the infestation in Massachusetts, you're more likely to see damage on a tree than the adult Asian longhorn beetle, but still good to know what to look for because there are some other longhorn beetle that are native. So it's good to look out for like the bright white splotches and the black and white antenna. This insect, you'll notice, has kind of a traditional life cycle with the larva and the pupa and the adult. The adults exist outside the tree. They lay their eggs, on the surface of the tree. When the eggs hatch, the larva bores its way into the tree, where it will drill a hole into the center of the tree, into the heartwood. They can spend up to 2 years inside that tree, eating away at the wood, developing. They'll eventually pupate and board their way out of the tree when they're adult, leaving behind these nice round exit holes. You can see this is what it looks like when they tunnel their way out. And after about 8 to 10 years of repeated feeding and all these galleries being built inside the tree from the larva feeding, that's eventually going to kill the tree. It's like it essentially girdles the tree because it's chewing these holes through the cambium layer that transports nutrients from the roots to the rest of the tree. So that's eventually going to choke off the tree's ability to feed itself. This also is a pretty extensive host tree list, but in this case, Asian longhorn beetle only goes after hardwood trees. Maple is their preferred host tree. We find them on all varieties of maple, the vast majority of which have been red maple, but they'll also go after sugar maple, nori maple, silver maple. Any species of maple is a favorite of this insect. Other common hosts include the horse chestnut, the elm, willow, and birch, all species of birch except for the sweet birch. And some other common hosts are sycamores, mountain ash, ash trees, poplars, and other cottonwoods. And then Mimosa katsura and golden rain tree are decorative trees that are native to Asia that are usually planted, introduced and planted for decoration. So native to the range of Asian longhorn beetle, so that's why it goes after them. The damage looks kind of like this. A couple things to look out for: the egg sites that are chewed by the adults. The female chews these little pits in the tree to lay the eggs. When they're fresh, they're kind of bright, and you can see like the mandible marks on the outside from her chewing the hole. When they're older, they get more faded, dark. Frass is the waste left behind by the larva as it eats its way into the tree. It's going to push out these long kind of wooden shavings, like matchstick shavings. But the best sign to look for are the exit holes left behind by the adult as they tunnel their way out of the tree. They're these perfectly round holes that kind of look like they were made with a drill, about 1 to 2 inches deep. If you put a pencil into the tree, as you can see in the picture, it goes straight in, not at an angle. So those round exit holes are really the best thing to look for. So, if you find a maple tree or other hardwood with these mysterious round holes, pretty good indicator that it's Asian longhorn beetle. Like spotted lanternfly, it was brought here accidentally through shipping through our global economy. Wooden containers made in China that were infested with the larvae were shipped over here, and by the time it got here, the adults had developed and they emerged and infested some trees in Worcester. So the map here on the screen is shows the quarantine in Massachusetts, which is where all the known Asian longhorn beetle in Massachusetts currently exist. That quarantine is about 110 square miles and covers the towns of Worcester, Shrewsbury, Boylston, West Boylston, part of Holden, and part of Auburn. There was a infestation in Boston that was declared eradicated in 2014. That was a very, very small infestation. They got rid of about 6 trees in total because they caught that infestation right at the beginning. By contrast, we've been dealing with the infestation in Worcester since 2008 when it was first discovered, and over 5 million trees have been surveyed so far. What it says on the slide there is not accurate. 5 million trees have been surveyed, and there's about 35,000 trees that have been removed. So a large number, but not 5 million. So that is still undergoing, and it's possible to kind of quarantine and eradicate this insect because it's very, very slow. It'll spend generations on one tree if possible. So by cutting infested trees down and wood chipping them, we're able to kind of kill any of the larvae that are currently developing in the tree and stop it from spreading. So we haven't had to expand that quarantine in Worcester since 2011 or 2010. So it's a good indicator that this strategy is working. Other live infestations in the United States are, there's one in Ohio that was discovered in 2011, and one in South Carolina that was discovered just last summer, that is currently, still currently undergoing that. In addition to the Boston eradication, when that was declared eradicated in 2014, ALB, or Asian longhorn beetle, was declared eradicated in New York City in 2019, and there are earlier infestations like in Chicago and Jersey City that were eradicated before 2008. So this insect has shown up a lot of places in the U.S. and based on the success stories of quarantine and cutting down infested trees that we've seen in like Chicago and New York now, we're confident that that's the direction we're going in Worcester. Next one is emerald ash borer, and I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to try and go quickly through these last ones. Its Latin name is Gryllus planipennis, and this invasive insect was first found in Michigan in 2002. But unlike Asian longhorn beetle, it has spread very, very rapidly and has threatened the ash population of the entire United States. It is responsible for the death of tens of millions of ash trees in Southeast Michigan alone. So you'll notice in the previous picture, you can see how small this is. And like Asian longhorn beetle, it is a wood-boring insect, and it has a similar life cycle with eggs being laid on the outside of the tree. The larva bores its way into the tree where it develops. It's protected inside the tree. And they don't go all the way into the heartwood like an Asian longhorn beetle. They're going to go right underneath the surface where they're eating the cambium layer, again, disrupting the tree's ability to feed itself, to supply nutrients. So it's going to kill that tree pretty quickly. The developed adults bore their way out of the tree. They fly around, they eat the leaves, they lay eggs, die off with the first hard frost. Signs of damage to look for, and again, this insect only goes after ash trees primarily. So you want to look for damage on ash trees. A couple of different distinct signs of damage. There's tunneling under the bark. If you kind of peel off the bark, right like that, you'll see these S-shaped galleries left behind by the larva. The adults leave behind these D-shaped exit holes. It's from the adults emerging and fly away. You can also look for epicormic sprouting, which are these shoots that the trunk puts out when it's stressed. It's trying to get more energy. And blonding is a great sign of damage. These are woodpeckers that are chipping away at the bark, trying to get to the larvae that are underneath the bark. So if you see an ash tree that's in poor health, that's got blonding like this, that's a pretty good indicator of emerald ash borer presence. And especially if you can see the D-shaped exit holes or the galleries under the bark, that's something you'd want to report. This insect is much smaller than the other two we talked about. It's about only a ½ inch long, but it's identifiable by this kind of blunt head shape. It's got this brilliant green, kind of metallic, shimmery color to its wing cases, and the body underneath the wings is kind of coppery, purplish red, metallic looking, very, very kind of distinct, brilliant looking beetle. And it is found in a lot of different places. So just in Massachusetts, it has been found in 175 different municipalities. The red is all the places where we found it. You'll know, of course, it's in a lot of places where there's more native ash, like the Berkshires, the western part of the state, not so much down on the Cape. But this was first found in Massachusetts in 2012, so it has spread quite rapidly since then. And since it was first found in southeast Michigan in 2002, it has spread to cover the entire Great Lakes region. It's in all of New England now, the Atlantic, all the way as far south as Georgia and as far west as Colorado. So this insect spreads very rapidly, not only through human methods, like moving firewood, but this insect can fly about 2 miles to find a new host tree. So unlike Asian longhorn beetle, which again will spend generations on one tree if possible, this insect can fly quite far or relatively further to get to a new tree. It also can kill ash trees, even relatively large ones, in maybe 4 years or fewer. So this insect is devastating and can spread very quickly. It's no longer a federally regulated insect. The methods of dealing with it have shifted from eradication, which are clearly in control, which aren't really, or rather you can't really eradicate and quarantine it, given how fast it's spread. But more of a control method. Specifically, USDA is focusing on biocontrols, on finding species of invasive wasps or parasitic wasps that they can release into the wild in controlled ways that will go after the emerald ash borer. So that has found success in very, very small controlled populations, and it's that's what USDA is working on for kind of their grand control strategy. The last two, can't say insect, worms not insect. These last two species I'm going to talk about very briefly are kind of here by popular request. The jumping worm is something that we've gotten a lot of questions about in the last 2 years because people have really noticed them. So of course, they are a non-native species of worm, but there is no native species of earthworm in Massachusetts or New England. All the earthworms that we have in this region of the world that we're used to are native to Europe, and most of them are native to Europe, and they've just been here for a long time. The jumping worm here, which you might also know by names such as Asian jumping worms, snake worms, or crazy worms, are native to Korea and Japan. And the reason people are so concerned about them is they kind of exist mostly on the very top layer of soil, and they kind of eat a lot of the nutrients that are in that soil. So rather than kind of going all through the soil and aerating it and kind of creating a slightly more habitable environment, they really chew through a lot of like the leaf litter and other organic matter. They leave behind these very distinct kind of big crumbly looking topsoil that kind of looks like coffee grounds. It's not really great for the health of an ecosystem. They can go through, like I said, like the leaf litter on a forest floor very, very quickly. And they might be spreading, through like eggs or their cocoons being in plant matter, like leaf litter or plants that are being shipped around. If you think you see one, and you can just, they're very large. They have this white kind of band at the top that's used for reproduction. It's kind of this milky white color. But if you think you find one, you can reach out to this email address right here. She works at UMass Extension and kind of does work with the jumping worm. So if you're concerned, that's the expert to reach out to. And they get their name by how kind of wiggly they are. You can see this video that they're much more active and wiggly than your typical earthworm. So that's where they get that name, crazy worm, jumping worm, etc. So if you want to look for that crazy wiggling movement as well as the large size and the white milky band. The last one is the Asian giant hornets. I hope you're not sick of hearing about these because they were all the rage last summer. So they do have the common name murder hornet, which is really kind of a false or alarmist name. Yes, it's true that they have these very large stingers and they can prove fatal to humans. But they're not responsible for more human deaths per year than the average honeybee or wasp is. So they're intimidating looking, but murder hornet's a not really necessary name. So they are native to Japan, and they were first identified in North America in British Columbia in Washington State in 2019. And they kind of popped up in the news again in 2020, which is when people started losing their minds about them. And for good reason, I suppose, because one, they do look pretty scary. You can see how large they are, and two, one of their main sources of protein for the developing eggs and larvae in their colony are honeybees. They will go after honeybees. Like European honeybees don't have a defense to help ward them off behaviorally, so they are pretty easy pickings for them. And yes, they can be harmful for humans. The only known nest that was found in the United States was, again, in Washington State. That was eradicated in 2020. There will be more searches for them to kind of see if they are going to show up again, but they have not been found in Massachusetts or, again, anywhere outside of Washington State. So if you see a big scary looking hornet or something in New England, it's probably one of these native or naturalized insects. The eastern cicada killer, which has more of a black coloration. Scary looking, pretty big, but it's relatively harmless. The males don't even have a stinger, and they go after cicada as their source of food. European hornet is not native, but it's been here since the 1800s, so it's pretty naturalized. I wouldn't want to get near them, but they're not the Asian giant hornet. And the bald hornet is smaller. It's got a more pale coloration to it, but this is also a native insect. It's also a paper wasp, so it builds those big papery nests versus the Asian giant hornet, which makes underground dwellings. So this is the last slide, and these are all useful links and websites you can use. I can put them in the chat as well, so you have direct access to the links. But if you ever see a invasive insect or signs of damage on a plant, or you think you see one, you'd want to report it at our website here, which is massnrc.org/pests. This is where we also have our fact sheets, so you can learn more about these insects. But that red link at the top of the page that says report a pest is where you'd want to go if you find something. You can follow us on Twitter at masspests. If you want some updates about, updates from our website, news articles, information about insects as they kind of emerge. My email address is right there, joshua.bruckner@mass.gov. If you have questions, you can always reach out to me. And this link right here, which I will put in the chat as well, you can use to order free outreach materials if you want to educate yourself, your community, your neighborhoods, or get cool things like these ID cards, so you can learn about lanternfly and have the reporting information right there, convenient in your pocket at all times. And that is it from me, and I think that's about 30 minutes. So at this point, I think we are going to take questions from the audience and from the chat box. I'm just going to leave this up for now so you can, Ramon, so you can see the links.
Yeah, that's great, Joshua. Thank you to you and Jennifer for really interesting programs and for including some of the more popular insects that have been in the news. I know people are curious. I'll just go ahead and read a few questions that have popped up over the chat, and then everybody, if you have questions, please type them up now. Russ is asked about some ash trees are showing resistance to the Eastern ash borer. Is that correct? And are there efforts underway to try and breed these resistant trees or save them?
So I definitely read about a bit about this, but I'm not an expert. Yes, there are. I think European species of ash have shown more resilience to emerald ash borer than the American species of ash, and they're in like places in Michigan that saw that initial wave of damage. There are some ash trees that survived that have shown more genetic resilience to emerald ash borer, and they are being studied to see if they can kind of be used to breed a more resilient strain of ash tree. And you know, this is kind of similar to like the program to breed a more resilient strain of American chestnut. You know, in the wake of the the chestnut blight. So this is definitely something you can look up. There have been studies done about it, but yes, there are some more resilient strains of ash.
Great. I think this is a question for Jennifer. Joel asked, is European buckthorn a lost cause?
I guess I'm not sure whether he's referring to common buckthorn or glossy buckthorn, but
I think glossy buckthorn.
Okay. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I don't consider any species a lost cause when you look at it from the perspective of wanting to sort of treat a local habitat rather than a species. So as long as your planning is sort of about like a whole habitat, coming from a whole habitat standpoint, then anything can be eradicated and any landscape can be restored. So, but glossy buckthorn is, it's really hard to deal with. That is definitely true. It's a challenge, but I know of a lot of ways that people have dealt with it and done some really nice restorations out in Western Mass. They just finished a really nice one in Hampton County, where they were dealing with buckthorn and probably 10 other invasive plants. So.
Hopefully that answered your question, Joel. If it didn't, just type a response in the chat. A comment about porcelain berry, that it's also an invasive species. Is that something that you work with, Jennifer?
I mean, we don't work specifically with it. It's already pretty well established, but I did, I thought I had said that it was invasive when I mentioned that it has the same blue colored berries. I apologize if I didn't. And I also see someone just asked about Phragmites. You know, my agency is very small and we tend to focus specifically on species that are already not established. And that's not true at all for Phragmites. I know that there are some other state agencies that are landowners. We aren't, that are dealing with Phragmites at some sites, but that's another really tough one to get rid of, especially because it you know, it's in wetland areas, which means that it's a challenge to do any kind of work there and still, you know, and make sure you're adhering to the rules of the Wetland Protection Act.
Another question from Russ from the beginning. If you had to guess, what % of knotweed patches were established by seed?
Yeah,
or does it mostly spread by?
So that was the subject of my PhD thesis. So I could talk for way too long about this. What I will say is that, you know, coming from the angle of people not even thinking that knotweed reproduced by seed for a really long time, and then discovering it did, you know, we went on to find really high germinability in the seeds that were taken from a variety of different knotweed plants, including some clear hybrids. And then someone in my lab went on to do a really excellent study that included a garden study and also testing and DNA analysis using flow cytometry of wild plants as well. And they found an incredible amount of inbreeding and introgression showing that there's been a lot of sexual reproduction in this species, which leads me to believe that there's a lot more seed establishment than people think there is. And not only that, but you know what shouldn't really be happening is when you get a lot of hybridization between Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed, and then the hybrids are doing what they call back crossing. So they're then breeding with Japanese knotweed because there's not a lot of giant knotweed. So it's mostly hybrid, what they call Bohemian knotweed, and then Japanese knotweed. And then my lab meat showed that even those plants, they were major pollen producers. They were highly fertile, and you wouldn't expect to see that. You'd expect to see a degradation of sexual reproduction the more and more back crossing you have, because the amount of DNA gets messed up. Like you have all these hexaploids that shouldn't be able to breed, and yet they were. So it's very viable, which is in direct contrast to what they were seeing in the UK, where they did studies that basically showed that like almost all the knotweed in the UK is just one giant clone that's been spread around. And that is totally not what is happening in the US. And I should really stop talking about knotweed because I'll seriously just run the timer out and stop talking about knotweed.
That's very interesting. Okay, we got a question for Josh. So we know that leaf-eating insects have evolved to live on single host species sometimes. Do we know what it is about the ash tree that has created that relationship with the emerald ash borer?
That's a great question, and I honestly don't know because I've never gotten that question about ash or emerald ash borer before. I do know for like Asian longhorn beetle, maple tree are most attractive because they have a higher sugar content and the bark tends to be thinner, so it's kind of a good sweet spot for them. Like hardwoods like oaks have a lot of tannin, and like therefore more they're less pleasant, less sugar for them to feed on. For ash tree, I do not know. That's the kind of thing I'd have to find a science paper that would talk about that.
Yeah, I don't know that either. I do know that it also uses fringe tree as a host, which is the same family but a completely different genus. So, but I don't know why. Those are tough questions to answer.
All right, I think that was our last question. Jennifer, did you want to quickly go through the word cloud and then we'll wrap
just going to
up?
go over quickly. So here's the nice word cloud. It looks like people in general thought that some type of bittersweet was going to be the most common one, and I kind of did too. It took the liberty of talking about it, but what I did was I went to the iNaturalist website. Can you see the iNaturalist site right now?
Yes.
I just want to check. Okay, I never know when I switch tabs if it's going to do that. So this is a pull from the Explore tab in iNaturalist, only showing non-native plants that are in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And what you can see is that we have the most observations of garlic mustard. So that's the top species. The next one, I mean, I don't know, greater celandine. That makes sense, especially since you're near Concord. I know that Walden Woods has a lot of greater celandine that I think was planted at some point. But you see multiflora rose and Japanese knotweed are up there too. So, and of course dandelion, but I don't count that one. So. Bittersweet is way down there, so I wonder if we just need to get people to get more iNaturalist observations into in for your town.
Yeah, I think there's still plenty of bittersweet in town.
There it is, 29 observations only. So,
well, thank you, Jennifer and Joshua. This is very interesting. I think we all learned a lot. And I'm not seeing any more questions on the chat. So I think we will end the program here tonight. So I hope everybody has a great night and enjoys the snow tomorrow.
Thank you for having us. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.